Okay, so I've been asked how I got involved in Iyengar yoga. I think I was 25 at the time, and I'd done a lot of sports and physical activities as a teenager and a young adult. Mountain climbing, a lot of swimming. I'd been on a swimming team, judo, fencing, lots of things like that, cycling. And from what I heard of yoga, I thought it was a lazy excuse for exercise, something for rather effeminate men and women to do, not for any real men to do. But to prove that, I went to a yoga class to gather evidence. And it happened to be a yoga class in our Buddhist center in London. And it was Iyengar yoga, and it was an extremely good teacher. And almost all the other people were of my age, in their 20s or early 30s. And I just found the class fantastic, in spite of my prejudices against it to start with. So I thought, well, this is the most scientific form of exercise I've ever encountered. So you're not just using muscles, you're extending them. And when it came to Shavasana, I just blissed out. So my only question was, when's the next class I can go to? So the problem with that class is I had to leave work early to get to it. But I discovered there was a class on the weekend as well. So I just started to go to classes and went around to other classes and then discovered there are other kinds of yoga and they did not interest me. So I didn't go to many other types of yoga. I just had enough to do with Iyengar yoga. And I heard about my teacher's teachers, one of whom was Sylvan Mehta, whose book is quite well known, Yoga the Iyengar Way, and other people. There weren't that many people very experienced in Iyengar yoga in the West, so you tended to encounter them. And it took me maybe a year to start a daily practice, and that was just about 25 minutes a day. And in retrospect, it was a very good practice. I just would do like one warm-up, 5 standing poses, Paschimottanasana, and then Shavasana. And that was a very, very good way to get started. And a few years later, I started to do longer practices. And my teacher, Lokamitra, encouraged me to train in Iyengar yoga. But that's how I started.
What about your beginnings in Mexico?
Beginnings in Mexico. Well, I was an established Iyengar yoga teacher, and I'd been a member of the Triratna Buddhist Order, or as we were then called, Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, since 1981. And then I was chairman of our center in Essen in Western Germany, and I took a sabbatical, a year's leave of absence. And within that, I spent 3 months in North America. And in the middle of that period, I came down to Mexico because I knew Upekshamati, then chairman of OBO, as it was called here. I knew him from meetings of the chairman, the Triratna chairman in England. And either he'd suggested or I'd suggested coming to Mexico, he was the only order member here then, to do something. So he knew I did yoga. I came down and was greeted by him, the Kavindu, and Jnana Dakini, who was teaching yoga in talleres in Coyoacan. And they had arranged for me to teach several yoga days and something else during a 2-week visit here. So that's how I started in January or February 1998. And then I didn't come for 1 or 2 years around 2001 because my girlfriend was very ill. I didn't come during the COVID years, but otherwise I've come every year. And once or twice I came twice a year. It just got established teaching yoga at that time in Yoga Espacio, which doesn't happen anymore, here. Sometimes with the old yoga center in Las Lomas, sometimes yoga retreats in the country, but it just happened and it developed more and more. Also teacher training things and various levels.
¿Cómo ha sido su evolución de enseñanza de los primeros tiempos a
Okay.
Can you talk about your evolution, your way of teaching, your evolution during that period of time?
Well, the evolution of my teaching, it's been evolution. That means not revolution. It's been very gradual. The only difficulty I had was when for about 2 years, I went to Angela Farmer, who was still just barely an Iyengar teacher, but an extremely gifted and creative teacher, who was working in a way that was not natural for me, but I found very, very useful. It was in many ways, you were not trying to do the postures directly. This is my language, not hers. You weren't trying to do the postures directly. You were trying to ground yourself, really make a connection between your body and the earth. Again, this is my language, not hers. And I found that very beneficial for me, also in my spiritual life in general. But I found I couldn't teach that to beginners. And I found very few situations in which I could teach it. So I stopped teaching for a year or so, until I had integrated that enough into my own practice, and then I taught relatively normally again. So that was the only abrupt thing. So I've been strongly influenced by the teachers who've impressed me. So my first teacher, Lokamitra, a Buddhist, he had almost like a standard format of the first half of the class was standing poses and the second half was sitting poses and inversions. So in many ways, that's what I still do on the rare occasions I teach a regular class. But I learned to teach yoga days from the model that Angela Farmer had done, but then I changed it and developed it more and more with time. I suppose just having more and more experience teaching things and seeing how the best teachers taught, like Donna Holloman, Faik Birria, John Flores, like Faik's unfortunately died, Victor van Koten, Christian Pisano, people like that. I've just learned so much from them and very grateful, and that's affected not just my yoga, but the way I pass it on. So you could say, I knew theoretically, but I had to learn that your teaching depends on your practice. It comes out of your practice.
What about Buddhism? Do you think that Buddhism has influenced in a way Iyengar yoga?
Iyengar yoga itself, or my practice of it?
It's in Iyengar or in Sutta?
Well, I can answer that simply. I don't think Buddhism or meditation has affected Iyengar yoga itself at all. But in terms of my own practice, yes. In terms of just the discipline of meditating daily, has positively affected the discipline of doing yoga daily. Also, just it's increased my mindfulness. It's increased my sensitivity, which are both extremely valuable for doing yoga, or maybe essential. And the other way doing yoga, I think, has kept me healthier, has helped my posture for meditation. I think Buddhism has affected my yoga teaching more than anything else, because of the tremendous value in Triratna that's given to metta. And so that has strongly affected my practice. So I try to teach from an inner feeling of metta, of loving kindness, and trying to be ethical the whole time, which is sometimes a challenge when you have to curb the noise and enthusiasm of 40 Mexicans, but at the same time, I don't want to be don't want to sound like a military dictator. Yeah.
Can you elaborate a little bit more around metta?
You mean a fundamental?
Yes, what I do.
Oh, okay. So metta counts as a Brahma Vihara. It's mentioned in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali in its Sanskrit form Maitri, with the three other Brahma Viharas, Karuna, compassion, Mudita, sympathetic joy, and Upeksha, equanimity. And the other three are based on Maitri or Metta, which means literally friendliness, but that's a far too weak term. It was used to be translated as love, which is good because it's an emotion and it's a positive emotion, but it's bad because it is too plastic, too many different sensations. So I tend to say either altruistic love or unconditional love or loving kindness or something like that. So it's a potentially very, very powerful emotion and impulse of human warmth, of just opening your heart to living beings, starting with yourself, friends, others you know, broader and broader circles of humanity and all living beings. So in fact, it's very good if you're superstitious and believe in ghosts and spirits, because then you include them in your metta as well. And the other very, very, very important facet of metta is caring, well-wishing, wishing the best for other people. And you do not prescribe what the best is, you just wish the best for them. Well, you do wish the best in terms of you wishing them happiness, because it's a Buddhist axiom, everyone wants to be happy, a fundamental assumption. And you wish the best, you don't want them to suffer. I mean, suffering is inevitable, but you really want them to suffer as little as possible. Yeah. And that's actually mentioned in Patanjali in one place, and apparently that's one of the very, very, very few references in Hindu scriptures to the Brahmaviharas. And scholars think that's actually been borrowed from Buddhism in Patanjali. At least a few years ago, scholars still thought that. I don't know what they think now. Yeah.
Can you tell us about when you meet Iyengar himself?
I first saw him in London, I think in 1976. I'd been doing yoga for 4 years. I did not get a place in classes. I wanted to go and watch a demonstration, but my teacher said, no, 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 no. That's quite artificial. Get a ticket to watch him teaching. You'll learn far more. And he was right. And it was like a lion patrolling through this hall of, I don't know, 50, 60 people. In a sense, positively tyrannizing them, or tyrannizing them in a positive way, demanding a very high status, a very high, not status, standard from them. Not the least bit interested if somebody was upset. He just demanded the best. And it was incredible just watching him do it. And some things you'd never forget. At that time, Shavasana was banned, and he called it devil's pose, because he said people just fall asleep or are unmindful. So instead you did a long Paschimottanasana. And it was either that, or for the women with their periods, he said 10 minutes Paschimottanasana. So he saw one woman lift her head up to the clock after 8 minutes. He said, start again. And that was the way he was. He was like a lion. And the next time was a year later in Pune, in an intensive course. And it was easy to get into classes then. The intensive course, there was only 25 of us, and we were taught simultaneously by him, Geeta, Prashant, and the senior assistant called Shah, who's unfortunately died since then. So we had 4 fantastic teachers for 25 of us. And we were young and strong, and after 2 hours in the morning, we were dead. It was like, one of the things was, he did not. So if you run a long distance, you pace yourself. You don't run as fast as if you're doing 50 meters. He demanded the 50-meter speed for 2 hours, and he got it from us. And you stopped thinking, I can't do this. So one day we were doing Viparita Dandasana, the full Viparita Dandasana on the floor. And one of my friends was very stiff in his chest. And the next day he saw pictures, and he said, but that's impossible. I can't do this posture. He wouldn't let you get away with that. He compelled you, in a sense, he persuaded you ferociously, you can do this, you will do this. And he just demanded the maximum. He always kept, to the maximum, to the maximum. And like one day we did 1 hour of back bends, and then the people came in from general classes and said, and now you'll do standing poses. Virabhadrasana 3, again and again and again. And there's these pictures of all of us collapsing. But he just didn't stop. And it was fantastic. We had different bodies after a month. They were really changed. And it didn't matter. Also, competitiveness disappeared. Because somebody else is being sort of yelled at and criticized one day, and you think, well, I'm going to be it tomorrow. It didn't really make any difference. And he was ruthless in his criticism. Yeah. So, yeah, it was very impressive. Yeah.
¿Qué es lo que se requiere en cuanto a la enseñanza del método Iyengar? ¿Qué es lo que considera?
What do you think is necessary in order to teach Iyengar yoga?
To do it. To really do it. So, many years ago when one of the Iyengar books, I think around 2000, a big blue book appeared, which was written about Iyengar and medicine, and there was a list of people in the back who did teacher training. And for some reason, my name was there for Germany. And a woman rang me up, and I said, well, do you do yoga yet? No. And I said, well, you have to first do yoga, do Iyengar yoga for several years. And she said, why? And how do you explain that to someone that, in a sense, you pass on what you have learned? So Donna Holloman, when she was still an Iyengar yoga teacher in my eyes, said the best way of teaching is friends ask you, well, what do you do? And you show them what you do. So it comes out of your own practice, how you teach. And so that's, I'd say that the most important thing is that you do it, you practice it. And then the second thing, that ideally, you're an apprentice with an established teacher. So I would say, best of all, you're going to fairly advanced classes so that you're practicing well above the beginner level, and you're being an apprentice and an assistant with a good, established, experienced teacher in beginners classes. So you see how they teach beginners. And so in a sense, that maybe is the new system of mentoring, so I think that's really, really important. I mean, that's how I actually learned. I was very fortunate. I learned primarily that way. I was an assistant to my teacher, Lokamitra, and an assistant to Silva Mehta, who was one of the authors of Yoga the Iyengar Way. And that's how I really learned to teach. And then, well, otherwise from my own practice. And then also, it's very important to keep going to classes yourself, to learn from people. And this year it's the first time in many, many, many years I have not been to any classes, but next year it'll be that. Yeah, yeah, again.
Como apoyando a la comunidad en México, de todos estos cursos que dan maestros, esta difusión que hace el método.
Can you elaborate a little bit around your contribution to the Iyengar yoga in Mexico? You're like giving the workshops and the other classes around.
Well, what did I contribute? I hope I communicated my enthusiasm, and just teaching in several places around and encouraging other people to teach, trying to be friendly while teaching yoga. Mm-hmm. Sometimes Iyengar teachers are not very friendly. So I suppose just convincing people it was valuable. At the very beginning, most of the pupils came from this, what was it called? Gran Fraternidad. Mm-hmm. And they were doing terrible things to their necks in Sarvangasana and terrible things to their knees forcing Padmasana. So I think I helped develop Iyengar yoga by telling them no, 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 and teaching them about the basic things with Sarvangasana, with support. And with Lotus, just telling them to stop to start with and do standing poses, things like this. And just convincing people, I suppose through the example and teaching normal classes, of the value of the basics. Basic standing poses, Adho Mukha Svanasana, basic forward bends, basic twists, basic inversions, and just how wonderful it is doing them. I hope that helped. Yeah.
A tricky question.
Sure, why not?
How you...
Bueno, el yoga Iyengar está cambiando mundialmente.
Yoga Iyengar is changing globally, and she wants to know if you have noticed that change in Mexico, in the Mexican practitioners of Iyengar yoga during this period of time.
Well, I think there's a lot more of them because, say, in the teacher's course I've just done here now, a few years ago, probably 2/3 of the people wouldn't have understood about straight legs, working with their knees, support in Sarvangasana, and now it's a minority. It's a minority. So there's far more people doing Iyengar yoga, and I think Iyengar yoga is influencing people doing other types of yoga more. Is that answering your question? Or?
Sí, es correcto. Sí.
Mm.
Bueno, es que también un poco de lo que decían en el curso, ¿no? Que la Iyengar yoga es muy rígida. O sea, tenemos en México esa idea.
In Mexico, we have that fixed idea that Iyengar yoga is a little bit rigid and dogmatic.
Mm.
But
Si él considera que es así, o
do you think that is
Oh, is that the difficult question? Is that the tricky question?
that yes? I suppose.
Well, unfortunately, I think it can be. I think Iyengar yoga is sometimes presented in a rigid way. Sometimes it's understandable. Like I've heard in one teacher training program, they spend months just doing Trikonasana, Parshvakonasana, Virabhadrasana, etc. And in Trikonasana, they're told, you teach these 3 points, that's it. But there's a certain value in that. It gives people a structure when they start to teach. I think it helps them understand the postures more. So there is a justification to a certain extent. But I think there's an unhealthy imitation of the personalities of Mr. Iyengar and Geeta Iyengar. Now, I'm not criticizing their personalities, but when I was learning to be a teacher, one of the mottos in England was, you are not Mr. Iyengar, so don't behave like him. So if you don't have 50, well, putting it bluntly, I think he was a yoga genius. And a genius behaves differently than somebody else. And if you're not a genius, don't imitate the way he talks and teaches. You know, he basically was fierce and he almost only criticized. And I don't think that that's necessarily helpful for other people to do it. So, and then sometimes there's a rigidity and you're told you can only teach these things because they're on your syllabus. I don't know what it's like now. And I personally thought that that was not that helpful, that people should, well, I'd say teach what they actually practice. So there were some things on the syllabuses I was allowed to teach, which I didn't practice, so I didn't want to teach them. And I didn't practice them because, in my humble opinion, they weren't as important as some things that weren't on the syllabus that I did practice. So I think what happens, one of the dangers is that people pay lip service. So yes, I'm doing exactly what we're supposed to do, but then of course they go outside these bounds because they're human beings. But I think, unfortunately, there's a bit of hypocrisy in that, and people won't admit, well, I'm doing that and that and that because I believe it's a good way to do it. Yeah. So for a long time, we were told no partner work at all. And as far as I know, there's not a problem with doing that anymore. But I mean, I kept doing partner work because I found it very useful. I was in Pune in 1995, and Mr. Iyengar interrupted a class that somebody else was teaching. I was in it. We were doing backbends, and you know, in backbends, you're not supposed to turn your feet out. He had us all turn our feet out. 2 helpers would push a wood up into your sacrum to get it as high as possible. So we were working in 3s. So of course, he's very creative, breaking the rules skillfully. And I think, well, within limitations, we should as well when it's sensible. Yeah. It was a wonderful class. Not because he broke the rules, but because it was sensible what he did. Yeah. Hmm.
Okay. Yes. You were talking about that you learn from your injuries?
In the class, yes.
No, in your life, I mean, in your practice. Can you talk a little bit about the injuries and the way you learn from them?
Okay, for example, in forward bends, we used to be taught, I don't know what happens now, we used to be taught really, you go forwards as far as you can, and more or less you can often go with a rounded back and you push forwards. And people would sometimes press on the upper back. And I injured my lower back. Quite a few people did, and that convinced me of the method where you keep your chest up, that you do not try to open your chest until you're as far into the pose as you can. So really working from the legs and the hips. That's one example of what I learned from an injury. So then I had a lot of problems with sacroiliac joints at one point. So it just gave me far more awareness in that whole area. I had lumbago at one point. And so I learned to actually keep the sides of my lumbar very, very even. So things of this sort, yeah. I've had, quite often, unfortunately it happened again a year ago, a shoulder injury, just falling on a shoulder. And realizing, well, you have to find a middle way, become more sensitive to how you work in the shoulder. Yeah.
Do you want to say something? We're about to finish.
Oh gosh, I don't think I have anything brilliant to finish. In a sense, maybe a childish comment. Practice, practice, practice.
No, it's not.
Okay?
Thank you very much.
Well, you're very welcome.